I can't. Yes, very good. Thank you very much, George. Right, so we're now recording. What I'm going to ask you, therefore, Jack, are you ready to go yet?
Yes.
Right. So will the rest of you please ensure that you are muted? If you're not sure where that is, it's on the bottom bar which says mute. And if you click on that, then your whole system will be muted. So let me just check. I think everybody appears to be muted. Thank you very much. Jack, would you like to get yourself organized and screen share? And then the floor is yours.
Right. So just about the screen share now. We're in the laps of the gods now. Here we go. Let's see where we are.
Takes a moment. Yeah, it takes a moment.
I think I see it.
Well, then press it. I forgot to say what the we've already said what the title of your talk was, which is the chapter 6 of Jack's book, Solomon, Symbols and Sex, a Ramble Around the Pillars, which of course is the title of the book itself, A Ramble Around the Pillars. I'll be talking about the book in just at the end of Jack's talk. Good, right. Okay, Jack, that's good. Will that go a little bigger, or is that?
I'm doing that now, Mike.
Okay, jolly good.
How's that?
Perfect, absolutely perfect. Floor is yours, Jack. Off you go. Thank you.
Excuse me, I've got a cold, so I may cough a little bit. Righty ho. So here we go. Well, good evening, brethren, and it's my pleasure to be giving another in the series of lectures. This one, as Mike said, is the paper from which the title of the book has been taken. Right at the start, though, I think I have to issue a warning, because this is a pretty raunchy paper, and the warning tells you that some content may offend. So it's up to yourself whether you hang in from this point on. Well, the rituals of Freemasonry, as everyone is aware, are based on the building of King Solomon's temple. In fact, there's a processed forest of paper which has been written on this subject, and it is very, very hard to find something new to say about it. No matter how much paper has been written, lots of what's behind this particular paper is contentious, and you'll always get arguments about it. I'll say something about that in a minute. Not only is the question, did the temple itself actually exist? Some people ask the question, did King Solomon himself exist? There's not one historical piece of empirical evidence to record the fact that the temple existed, although I have uncovered something which may cause us to have a little bit of hope there, and I'll refer to it later. The British Oxford trained archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, who passed away back at the beginning, late 1970s, was very active in the area, and she was of the opinion that the temple did not in fact exist. More recently, an archaeologist called Ernest Marie Lapouraz wrote an article entitled King Solomon's Temple Still Supports the Temple Mount. And that paper was written in the online Center for Judaic Studies, and it's in the May-June 1987 edition, I suppose you call it, of that. So really, what remains in the absence of firm empirical evidence is the biblical evidence. And to me, then I have to say it's a matter of its existence being a matter of belief. And I think there's not much to begin by arguing the point. So the premise of this paper is that the temple did exist, and I work from that basis. As you know, the building of the temple is used as an allegory for the rituals in our orders. Just take a look at that slide, because the building of the temple is quite interesting, the slide. You can see that the masons in the forefront are laying the blocks. One is measuring the trueness of the building by using a square edge, and the fellow over to his right is making sure that the block settles down nicely and using a mallet. Behind him it's even more interesting to me, because if you're familiar with the biblical story, the priests or Levites paraded around the temple during the build, clashing cymbals and blowing trumpets, and there indeed is the representation of them doing it. So for us, we take good men and we make them better, and the inner temple is what we as masons are concerned with. But of course, for the purpose of this paper, what I'm concerned with is not the inner man, but the meaning behind the design, not so much of the temple, though perhaps a little bit of that, but the design of the pillars at the porch or entrance to the temple. So what then is the scope of the paper? Well, the paper, as I said, my premise is to accept the biblical description for the purposes of writing the paper. That doesn't mean I swallow it hook, line, and sinker, but for the purpose of the paper, I take the biblical description. It's been supported by chroniclers nearer to the time, and I mentioned some of those in the way through, for example, Herodotus, and we'll say something about him a little later. Initially, the scope of the paper is broken down into three sections. The first section considers the temple's physical construction. That's when the pillars were erected and they were named. The second focus is on the actual origin of the pillars and what their significance might be. And the third focus is on the legacy of the pillars as far as the design of medieval Christian churches is concerned. So the background to the temple, what I've got on the screen there on the left-hand side is what you might call a floor plan of the temple. Now that floor plan, if you're familiar with the descriptions in both Kings and Chronicles in the Old Testament, it's pretty accurate. It sticks reasonably accurately to what is described in the biblical account of the temple. If you come through the steps up into the entrance to the courtyard, because it's in behind the courtyard, you have what's called the brazen altar, and to the bottom of that picture is the molten sea. Those are described in the biblical description. To either side of the temple proper, you have a series, 10 in number, of what's called lavers and bases. Lavers, of course, are ablution type things, and they're on bases. To the right, I have actually produced an image of a laver sitting on a base, and that's exactly as it's described in Chronicles, because it sits on wheels. So that's described in the biblical text, that these lavers sit on wheels. If you come through the courtyard and start to enter the temple, you'll see that outside in the porch or entrance are represented the pillars Jac and Boaz. When we go through into the temple, heading toward into what's called the holy place, leading towards the Holy of Holies, you can see that there are representations of what are little tables. They've got a menorah showing on them. And those little tables were in fact tables for the Levites to put what's known as shewbread. Showbread would be just as good a word. Shewbread is kind of like a communion bread. And the bread would be placed on those little tables, and it would stay there for a week. It ran between one holy day and another, and it's there for the god, for the deity, of course. And at the end of this time, even though it might be a little stale, the priests or Levites, if they so chose, could eat it. But there was a rule in terms of whether they could eat it or not. They could only eat it if they were in a sanctified area. So we come through the altar of incense, and we go through the veil, and we come to the whole purpose of the temple, because the temple was built, you may remember, King David decided he wanted to build the temple, because God suggested that he might. Prophet Nathan told him what the prophecy was. And in there resides the Ark of the Covenant. So that's a pretty good representation of what was in the temple. An alternative and more appropriate tradition to the shewbread would be to call it the presence bread, because it's bread which is meant to be there in the presence of the deity. And the Bible tells us that there was always supposed to be bread mixed to a particular recipe and sitting in inside the temple. The idea to build it, as I said earlier, was King David's, Solomon's father, and its purpose was to house the Ark of the Covenant. It was a fitting place for God to dwell. According to the biblical report, in his discussions with the prophet and with David, God said that he had not had a proper place to reside in all the time that he was with the chosen people. And he said that that the Ark of the Covenant had always resided behind curtains. And you can take curtains to be a synonym for a tent. And that's exactly, of course, what was happening. They were traipsing about through the desert, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant and sheltering it in a tent. So it was designed purely to house the Ark of the Covenant. According to the biblical text, God forbade David from actually being the builder of the temple because he had blood in his hands, because he was a very active military leader and he had blood in his hands. But David nonetheless was, according to the biblical text, active in the design of the temple, and he is said to have provided some of the design, particularly for the area around the porch, to his son, King Solomon. For those of you who are interested, I don't want to sound like an old-time preacher, but for those of you who are interested, this is all covered in First Chronicles 28, and that's probably worth a read if you're interested in that particular detail. The beginning of the project was that David, having been instrumental in providing some of the design for the temple, also acquired the land. Now, the biblical story tells that he actually bought the land on Mount Moriah, and I provided a little schematic of the area to show you where it is, because he went to the owner of the land, who was called, I think his name was Ornan. He was a Jebusite, and he went. King David went and said that he wanted to buy the land. It's near, if you look to the right of the schematic, you can see the Mount of Olives, with which people will be much more familiar. The Mount of Olives is the place where, according to the New Testament story, Jesus went to pray, and it's meant to be the place where he ascended into heaven. So that's the area. Some of it you will notice. Mount Zion is another bit that people would be familiar with. So it's really, although it's called Mount Moriah, it's really a large flat expanse with a bit of a slope, and so a large expanse in the area which was suitable for building the temple. When David went to the owner, he said he wanted to buy it, and the owner immediately said that he would give it to King David, and David is reported in the Bible to have said that he could not take it for free, because then it wouldn't be suitable for giving burnt offerings. Must be acquired with consideration given, and so he paid for the piece of land. Mount Moriah is much more well known now if we just don't call it Mount Moriah and we say the Dome of the Rock, because that's where the Dome of the Rock is. So if you look at the picture on your screen, you will be familiar with that image of the Dome of the Rock. You'll also be familiar with the image down in the right hand, heading towards the right hand quarter of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Islamic mosque. And you'll be familiar on the western side with the Western Wall. Even though I said at the beginning that there is no archaeological evidence, solid archaeological evidence for that the temple ever existed, some archaeologists don't accept this. And some of them argue that there has never really been a proper opportunity to explore the area, which is covered in the picture on your screen. For one thing, the site remains a place of active worship and always has been. The authority that actually controls that whole compound, you can see within that rectangle, the authority which controls the compound is an Islamic council called the Waqf, that's W-A-Q-F, and it has long forbidden any excavation of the area at all, considering any excavation or breaking of the soil to be a desecration of the area. So except for some clandestine ventures at the end of the 19th century by some wayward European adventurers, and some minor archaeological works which were carried out when Al-Aqsa Mosque was undergoing some renovations between 1938 and 1942. The layers of history, and this is what has been said by a researcher, Joshua Hammer. He said, this is reported in the Smithsonian magazine. He said that the layers of history which lie beneath the Temple Mount remain tantalizingly out of reach. So there may well be stuff to be discovered underneath if they could get excavation rights. I did read another article where some people claim to have extracted a part of a wall from the temple. And the debate was not really whether it was a wall from King Solomon's temple, but whether it was a wall from a subsequent temple, because there have been several temples built on that particular site. Influences on the design then of King Solomon's temple. This is an image of the temple at Palmyra. Throughout the Middle East and indeed the Near East, there are many relics of temples which resemble the one that you're looking at on your screen. The thing you can see is that it's got an entrance, and in front of the entrance, it's got two columns. These are common characteristics. So if you went and had a look at any other temple in the Middle East, well, not any other temple, but many other temples in the Middle East, you'll find that the general design was a courtyard, and within the courtyard was the inner sanctum. And there were areas outside marked off by stones, and almost always two pillars at the entrance. So what I'm saying at that point, excuse me while I have a drink. What I'm saying is that the biblical description of the design of the Temple of King Solomon is not unique. It's common in the area. Well, as I said at the beginning, the whole building idea and the design of the temple, it's all explained in the books in the Old Testament are Kings and Chronicles. Lots of questions arise, and they've been debated ad nauseum in the literature. Is the temple, are the pillars, for example, freestanding, or are they load-bearing? Some of the images I showed you were obviously load-bearing images. Are boas, if you talk about the pillars, boas and Jachin being on the left and the right, is that when you're looking into the temple or when you're gazing out of the temple? Are the pillars solid or hollow? And indeed, some lodges, one in particular that I can refer to in the Channel Islands, I think St. Helier, in their lodge rooms have hollow pillars in which they keep the lodge charter. And the other question, of course, is, and I think I've dispensed with the particular question, the question is, are they unique to King Solomon's temple? So I think I've given an answer to the last bit. They're not unique, and maybe we can consider some of the other questions which arise. We can be sure, though, that the pillars did stand at the entrance of the temple, and the only source for this, no, let me rephrase it. The source for this, in a sense, is not just from the Bible. I think I have established that it's very likely that the base of the design, the basis of the design, whereas the other temples in the area of the Middle East. And so other commentators have reported on those other temples. Flavius Josephus, who was a historian in 37 AD, he lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. In his writing, The Antiquities of the Jews, he refers to the pillars by name and locates them at the entrance of a porch. He's not really, I think, talking specifically about King Solomon's temple, but what he's saying is it's not uncommon to have pillars given names, and we'll consider why that might be the case. It sounds a little unusual, but there are reasons why it might in fact be the case. There is also discussion as to whether the perspective is from the person entering or leaving. I've already mentioned that. And I think we can discount that argument because some people say, well, it must be looking out. If the temple is built on an east-west axis, it must be on the priest looking out at the rising sun. But that's not, in my opinion, a valid answer. I think the answer is very simple. I think if you're discussing the pillars erected at the porch or entrance of King Solomon's temple, before you can ever be in the temple to come out and look at them on your exit, you've got to be walking in. So my argument is that when we talk about one on the left, one on the right, and give them their names, Boaz on the left, Jachin on the right, that's from the perspective of someone looking into the temple. I just put this one up for a little diversion because I want to make a comment about those pillars, but obviously those are pillars in a lodge room. I have to say, in my lodge room, the pillar completely stops me seeing the master at work, but that's he's not a particularly handsome chap, no offense. So it doesn't really matter. But joking aside, if you look at those pillars that are on your screen and you come up the pillar to where it starts to flare out, that's called the chapiter. Those bits at the top are called the chapiter. And the chapiter has a particular design. It's got a very specific design in the case of King Solomon's temple, and I will come back to that. But if you look at that, it's almost like a Corinthian pillar design. And if you look at that, unfortunately, the definition isn't good enough, but it's almost inevitable that somewhere on that pillar, there will be some element of a fertility symbol. And I'll show you another example on another slide, not too far from now. But there's usually meaning in terms of the design of that chapter. The interesting thing from my point of view, having researched this, is the globes, which almost inevitably sit on top of the pillars. Now, I'm happy to be told what the answer to this is because I don't know it, but I can see no biblical justifiable reason for having globes on the top because the Bible is very clear that on top of the chapiters were, in fact, what they call lily work. So in other words, the lily was a plant. You know the Egyptians had it in their hieroglyphics and such like. The lily was a plant in the Middle East which was revered in a religious way, and the Bible tells us very clearly that the pillars of King Solomon's temple at the very top had lily work. So I can see no justification for the fact that we have globes on top. Some people say, well, even back in the days when King Solomon was building the temple, they didn't know that the world was round. That's an argument I'm not going to get into, but even so, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is the design given by the Bible is lily work. And usually on those chapters, there will be some element of a fertility type symbol. What I've got there, I'm sorry you can't read the text, and I can enlarge it, but I don't want to fiddle with anything. You'll understand from my previous attempts to get loaded on these at the lectures. We're working nicely, and I'm not going to touch anything I don't have to. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to read it. It's just explaining what it says in the Bible to what's on the pillars. So if you look at the top of the pillars, Boaz and Jachin, indeed, those spiky things you can see are the lily work. Below that, on the little swollen bit, and they're not globes, you have a network, and it's called a network. And on top of that network, you have a series of chains. On each of those pillars, there are 7 going around let's call it the circular bit. As you come down, and this is the most interesting part, if you haven't considered this before, when you look at those pillars, just below, just at the top of the pillar, before it starts to meet the chapiter, you can see 2 rows of little marbles, perhaps, right? You can see that going around, and that's actually pomegranate seed, right? That's what that is. And then the rest of the pillar is bog standard, except for the fact that it's very specific in the sense of what height it might be. And there's a lot of argument about the height of the pillars. The Bible tells us that the 35 cubits. And you will be aware that the cubit in the olden days where it was the measure from the tip of your middle finger to your elbow. I'm assuming everybody had the same length of arm, but we'll not dwell on that one. Anyway, so it's 35 cubits, and that actually matters quite a lot. One of the other questions which arises there's an inconsistency in whether you read it in Chronicles or whether you read it in Kings in the Old Testament. But the inconsistency is accounted for because there is an argument, and I think it's a valid one, that the pillars were actually cast in one piece and then split. And I won't go into the details as to why there's a contention there, but that helps to account for it. And also whether the pillars were meant to be freestanding or load bearing. I think you can see from the design that's in front of you, it's highly unlikely that they were load bearing pillars. In fact, I'm sure they weren't. Now, the idea about the checker work and the design at the top is something which I'm going to come to when I get to the more salacious part of the paper, and that might fascinate you to some degree. What I will say, though, is that in the Bible, in Kings chapter 7, verse 19 tells us that at the top of the chapters, there was some lily work, which you could see, and I emphasize it doesn't mention globes at all. Verse 17 tells us that. Verse 18 mentions the pomegranates, and pomegranates are a very important fruit in terms of Middle Eastern lore, and you'll understand why quite soon. The verse 18, as verse 20 does, tells us that the pillars had pomegranates, and it says, and I'm quoting directly from the King James Version of the Bible, also above, over against the belly of which was the network, and the pomegranates were 200 in rows round about the chapter. So 200 of them, lots of them. Verse 21 then tells us that he set up the right pillar and called it Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and called it Boaz. Now, the pillars and Herodotus. Herodotus lived from 484 to 425 BC, and he has been throughout history a respected reporter of the antiquities and of the history of the time. Unlike, I think I mentioned that at a previous lecture, unlike other commentators who have gone through the classical period, so to speak, Herodotus didn't generally just report what somebody had told him. He went to look. He went as far as Russia, and he went down to Greece and around that area, and he eventually came to retire and settle into Russia. And he wrote about things that he saw. And I've got 2 copies of Herodotus' histories, and in the histories, he describes a visit to Tyre in the Middle East, and he was visiting the temple of Heracles or Hercules, depending on whether you want it in Latin or Greek. And he says in his writings, I visited the temple and found that the offerings which adorned it were numerous, not least remarkable being 2 pillars, one of pure gold and the other of emerald, which gleamed in the dark with a strange radius. Now, it's highly unlikely, this is just my opinion, by the way, this is not historical fact. It's highly unlikely that there was an emerald big enough to build these pillars, but I suspect it may have been jade, polished jade. So that's a suggestion. Herodotus then decided to question the priests at the temple of Heracles and as to the age of the temple itself. And the priests told Heracles that the temple was as ancient as Tyre itself, and that Tyre, in their reckoning, was 2,300 years old. So that's how old that temple was meant to be. The point is that the temple at Tyre was older than King Solomon's temple. That's what they were saying. Herodotus's accounts are reasonably reliable. Cicero called him the father of history, and he was very well traveled and had prodigious output. And some of his output, if there's any Jewish people listening, they will perhaps be able to confirm this. In the Jewish Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, lots of what he writes about the area at the time and the temples that were there is vindicated in the Tanakh. The design of the pillars, there's no particular meaning to that slide, except the design varies depending on which images you look at. And I thought that one, being a Masonic design, so to speak, or having Masonic symbols within it, is quite interesting. Manly P. Hall, who was a very prolific author of Masonic text in the late 19th century and part of the 20th century, I believe, did some description of pillars in a superb book that he wrote called The Secret Teaching of All the Ages. And he said that on top of each pillar was a large bowl, and one of the bowls, and this is to me very interesting, probably contained fire. Such a bowl was known to have what they called a fiery cresset, a bowl containing fire and the other bowl containing water. One of the bowls, the bowl of fire, was known as the celestial bowl, and it surmounted the right-hand column, and it symbolized the divine man. The other bowl, known as the terrestrial bowl, had water and was surmounting the left-hand column, Boaz, signifying the earthly man. Some debate as to whether the bowl on top of the pillars were actually fire altars. There's quite a lot written on this. Some people think they were fire altars, and some people think that they were not fire altars. My own view is I've completely discounted the idea they might have been globes. They may have contained water. They may also have been fire altars because fire, of course, had religious symbolism in those days, as indeed it does in some religions now. So the next question becomes, excuse me, why give the pillars names? What's the story with the names? Well, some people think that the names they're not sort of graffiti that somebody put on in passant, so to speak. Some think that they're not proper names, but part of a longer text, some sort of philosophical / religious text carved onto the pillar. Not specifically in the case of Boaz and Jachin, but in other pillars. Perhaps it's been suggested they were religious texts, such as a royal hymn. Are the names Hebrew translations of Babylonian gods? That's another suggestion. They may well have been, Kilroy was here, they may well have been the names of people who were involved in the construction of the temple, and they may have represented royal persons. Boaz and Jachin are the ones that are the names which were given according to the description of King Solomon's temple. And we do, of course, know who Boaz and Jachin were. We know, for example, that Boaz was King David, King Solomon's great grandfather, I think. And he was actually the husband of Ruth. If you go back into the biblical texts to the book of Ruth, you'll find him there. I think that Boaz is only actually mentioned about twice in the Bible. And Jachin also has been a common name in the Middle East during the period. And it's not at all an uncommon name. It's mentioned more times in the Bible than Boaz is. And of course, you know that they represent strength and wisdom. I've just forgotten what we said in the Masons. Perhaps you could help me there. It's to establish and strength. So there we go. Now, I did give you warning at the beginning, so if you're of a delicate disposition, now is the time to go away. So we're going to have a look at the fertility and phallic symbolism of the pillars. It's really getting now to the spicy stuff. So you've been warned. The pillar that you're looking at, when we looked at the pillars in the lodge rooms, I said I would come back and describe something similar which contained a fertility symbol. Can anybody say, I don't want anybody to answer me, but a rhetorical question, can you see a fertility symbol on that pillar? Well, I'll give you the answer. If you look at the top of the middle of the middle of the chapiter, you can see a little sort of projection, and that projection is a pine cone. Many, many pillars in medieval times, not just religious pillars, but pillars often had a pine cone because it represents fertility because of the number of seeds contained within a pine cone. And you'll see that on many pillars. The pomegranate on the pillars that I was referring to earlier represents also a profusion of seeds. That's why they use the fruit. And it implies fertility. It supports the phallic nature of the pillars, and it's long debated in Freemasonry. This isn't something that I've just dreamed up to spice up this particular lecture. There has been lots of material written on it. And in fact, it's been bowdlerized from time to time, because it may well be that it's been too spicy in some areas for people to want to accept or to be aware of. And in some texts where this phallic nature has been described, there were earlier attempts at bowdlerizing. If you don't know what bowdlerism is, the early Shakespeare, the Shakespeare texts in the Victorian age, early Victorian age, were modified by a man called Bowdler to take out the interesting bits. And it certainly spoiled Shakespeare. That's when we refer to bowdlerism, we mean people are sanitizing in some sense the particular text. So some lodges, as I said earlier, used hollow pillars, and this was, as I said, sometimes used to keep the warrant. J.S.M. Ward, who was a prolific Masonic writer, wrote about the temple at Astarte in Hierapolis, about two large pillars, and he described a ceremony that he believed existed where a priest would enter the hollow pillar, and he would ascend, the people would be gathered, and he would ascend the hollow pillar inside, and he would make prayer and such like in order to encourage the harvests and such like. Now, some people have said if it was in order to have prayers for fertility and it had phallic symbolism, one has to speculate as to what this solitary priest got up to when he was up in the pillar, but it would have been a lonely experience, and we won't dwell on it. The early phallic interpretations, as I said, may have been a bit too licentious, but there's been a fair bit of writing on it since. A more recent writer called Badillo, B-A-D-I-L-L-O, Badillo, in his short paper called Sex and the Temple, its symbolism and meaning, agrees with the phallic interpretation of the pillars. The Bible describes the decoration as having pomegranates above and also against the belly of the network. That's from the King James Version. And the pomegranates were 200, which I mentioned earlier. The pomegranate seeds, according to other writers, represents sperm. And the capitals themselves in some of the writings are also said to represent the male testes. Now we get to the bit that says, well, what then was the idea of the netting designed in the temple? And some writers have argued that the netting, in terms of the phallic representation, represents the textured skin of the male scrotum. This story gets a little worse, so I hope nobody has fainted yet. The upright pillars, the upright nature of the pillars, can only be left to your imagination. Now, when I was trying to think of a symbol to put on this slide, I had a very wide range of choice, and I decided to err on the side of decency. And I have chosen a pillar, which is an obelisk, which is very similar to the obelisks that are in London and New York, known as Cleopatra's Needle. Those obelisks also are described by archaeologists as being of a phallic nature. Bible scholars and historians have long claimed that the pillars which stood outside a temple are indeed phallic symbols. And I've mentioned the upright nature of the pillar being self-descriptive, so to speak. The Badillo, in his previously mentioned paper, describes the pillar as, and this is talking about the King Solomon's pillars, as a 120 cubit porch being a male genital organ, symbolizing Jacob fathering the nation of Israel. And at its entrance, and the entrance likely not to have doors, is in fact, when you describe it in phallic terms, the woman's vaginal opening. Now, this then takes us to the thing about entering and leaving the temple. And one can imagine then that one can speculate on the whole principle of the spiritual image being a rebirthing experience. Underlying the whole theory is the story of Eden, and it's called the Edenic hypothesis. I'm not saying I believe all this, by the way. I'm merely representing the stories. In cases where the pillows are hollow, I've already described the situation with terms of the priest going inside to the top, a bit like the imam going to the top to do the prayer. Now we move, we're over the worst bit now in terms of its delicacy. We're now going to have a look at the orientation of the temple in antiquity, and it's going to lead us to consider the design of Christian churches. Temples often, not always, but often are built on an east-west axis. And the priest progressing from the porch facing east towards the rising sun. So if he's coming down towards the porch, he's facing the rising sun. Since pre-Christian times, monuments have been positioned to receive either the rising or setting sun. The church's east-west orientation with the altar in the east allowed the rising sun to shine its rays on to the and to illuminate the altar. Cook, S.A. Cook, writing in Religion in Ancient Palestine, describes a temple at Byblos around about 1500 BC with this east-west orientation and also with the pillars. He also talks about stones which were erected outside temples, and these stones can be seen in Transjordania and at a place called Shechem. And there are indeed coins from the 1st century AD, from Cyprus, from Sidon, and from Pergamon, showing twin pillars at temple entrances. Lucian, the Greek writer in 2 AD, wrote about twin pillars at a temple in Heliopolis. Posidonius, the Greek writer in 100 BC, described 2 bronze columns at Heraklion. Other esoteric meanings of the pillars. There can be no serious doubt that the design of the temple and the twin pillars have their origin in earlier pagan temples. I've just put that image up to show that here indeed is another image of pillars and a Masonic symbol in the middle of it all. I have no idea where it is, but it has a kind of Mediterranean look to me, and that's probably where it is. Archaeologists describe the ancient stone pillars as mesoboths, and they are common in the temples erected by early Semitic people. And the archaeologist Eckenstein has written quite prolifically on this. Palazzo, another writer, writing in 2017, referred to the pillars and said, "The one thing about Freemasonry which both attracts and repels is Freemasonry's ostensible connection with all things esoteric. It has become both a blessing and a curse, which in itself is ironic, as the pillars are also said to have a dual purpose, because philosophically and spiritually, they represent opposing forces. Pillars made of brass or bronze, and I need to say here that when the Bible describes the pillars being made of bronze, it sometimes says bronze and it sometimes says brass. I don't think there was a great distinction back in those days, and it may have been difficult to get tin, for example, but however, they're known as the sun metal in the case of the brass and the moon metal in the case of the tin. And so who knows whether they are brass or bronze, one or the other. They represent harmony. This is the pillars I'm talking about, represent harmony and balance, and passing through the pillars can be viewed and is viewed by some writers as rebirth. And that corresponds then with the phallic nature of the symbols. I just pop up here the image of the tree of life, because that also is impacted on by our consideration of the significance of the pillars and the spiritual element of it. And here we have a well-known image on the left, and that, of course, is from the tarot, the high priestess. Those of you who are familiar with the tarot will be well aware that that's a specific card. Well, it's a specific card, but from a specific version of the tarot, being the one by A.E. Waite. Not all tarot cards have the B and the J. So in the hidden realm of the occult, we have the high priestess. The pillars astrologically represent the zodiacal signs Cancer and Capricorn. The position of the high priestess between the two pillars represents a state of equilibrium, and some interpret this as representing wisdom. Now, Christian churches, we've talked about the pillars and the fact that they're on the outside or the porch or entrance of King Solomon's temple. There's Durham Cathedral on the left and Westminster Abbey on the right. And they've each got those towers, which can be described as pillars. And they're to each side of the entrance to the church or abbey. There's Rheims Cathedral, pillars to the left and to the right. They, of course, are designed, but they're still pillars. There's Chartres, and there's Notre Dame as well. But always in the Christian churches, or not always, but almost always in the medieval Christian churches, there are what can be described as pillars to the left or right of the entrance. I almost put in my old cathedral in Belfast where my parents were married. I wasn't a page boy at the wedding, by the way, because anybody wants to make a joke. And it also has the idea of having the pillars at the left or right of the porch or the entrance. So that brings me to the end of my paper. And the conclusion is Nec plus ultra. It was said at the end of during the early history periods that there was nothing beyond the pillars of Hercules, and it said that that's what was written on the pillars of Hercules. Nec plus ultra, meaning nothing beyond. And I think there is nothing beyond what I have presented tonight to be said further about the pillars on the temple of King Solomon. So, as I said earlier, I'm not saying I buy into all of it, but I think it's been an interesting paper and I hope you will agree. Thank you very much.
It's really interesting.
Well, Jack, what I'm going to do in a few minutes is to ask Alan Hart from the Wellington Lodge of Research just to say a few words of thanks, because you would have been their guest tonight and you would have been dining, you would have been at a banquet afterwards, but I hope you've provided your own. But in the meantime, while Alan's getting ready, can you stop your screen sharing?
I can. Just give me a sec.
Then we'll be able to see more people. Very good. That's good. Yep, I can see lots and lots of people now. And those of you who, if you'll just wait until Alan said a few words, and then you can unmute yourself, those of you that have got any questions or comments. Alan, are you there?
Yep. Thank you very much, Mike. It's very kind of you to allow me to say welcome to what would have been the Research Lodge of Wellington number 194 regular September meeting, which 2 years ago, Mike, you were our guest speaker. So hence, you know, the quality of our wining and dining. So I'm sorry, Jack. First of all, thank you personally very much. When I was asked to go back into the chair after nearly 30 years, I naturally sorted a number of people like yourself who were willing to provide a paper to us, and I was delighted 2019 that you accepted my request. It's a pity that this little pandemic's meant that the plans have gone a little bit awry. that invitation remains there, and I'm sure Jeff Coker, as my successor, will make certain that next year there is a suitable time when you can come down and enjoy our company. Mike, also to you and George, can I say thank you? All the hard work that you both put in, George, for the hassles in facilitating what's been up to 58 people on at any one stage,
Yes.
which I'd have to say reflects the quality of your presentations and shows to all of us the value of doing things like this. Our numbers here are probably double what we would have had physically at the Wellesley tonight, even with a very cheap subsidised meal. It was going to cost you $10 and you were going to get a minimum of $30 meal. So we're a good host. Thank you again, Mike. Thank you, George. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you to Alan. Right, now, if you wish to unmute yourself, if you want to say something or pass a comment, if you're not, then you might as well keep yourself muted and then we don't get any interruptions. And I think, Brendan, you put a message through about that that little monument thing that you knew where it was, that Jack...
And you had seen it somewhere before. I initially thought it was in America, but it's actually in Israel, I think. And it actually sits in a roundabout, excuse me, a roundabout in the middle of the road. So I'm not quite sure the history of it, but I knew I'd seen it somewhere before.
Right, okay. Thanks for that. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Kerry Nichols. Can you tell me in the tarot card of Waite's Tarot, the significance of the colour of the left pillar being black and the right pillar being white? We all have an understanding of the black and the white, but can you elaborate on that, or can
Yes, I think I actually have a set of tarot cards sitting here, but I don't think I need to actually look at it. It's quite simple. It represents opposing forces, good and evil, black and white. That's what it represents. It's the opposing forces. So we just assume it's like the cowboy pictures, you know, the baddie with the black hat and the goodie with the white hat. So yeah, that's what it represents, Kerry.
Thank you. Yeah.
The yin and the yang is in another culture, isn't it?
Yes, same thing.
Opposing forces, the male, female, the good, the evil, and so on and so on. Yeah. Okay. Other comments?
Can we construe from that some Masonic significance then? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have any thoughts on it, except it's a matter of equilibrium. And I think one could argue that in lodges, when we're having the lodge, we're trying to maintain a state of equilibrium. That's why we don't allow discussion on religion and politics, for example, in lodge meetings. So we're in a state of trying to create equilibrium, and that's what the significance of it is, in my opinion. I don't really read the tarot cards, so I don't know a lot about them, but that's my view.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Jack, thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. It made me realise for the first time that the two towers either side of a cathedral door could represent the two pillars and continue an ancient tradition right up into modern day, the modern day world. It was very interesting when you said about all the churches facing east and west. When I was brought up with a rather sort of strict church upbringing, we were told that the reason the churches in England seemed to face east was actually not quite right. They actually faced Jerusalem. So that when you genuflected to the altar, you were actually genuflecting to Jerusalem.
I'm not sure if that's correct, Joe. I mean, I appreciate it's what you were told, but I think it's a well-established fact that Christian churches were oriented west to east. And there may be a confusion there with the Muslim practice of praying towards Mecca.
No, there's no confusion there. This is what we were taught as young boys in RI, as it was called in
Yeah.
those days.
Sure, sure.
Which always made me think that if you are on the other side of Jerusalem, would your church be around the other way?
Yeah.
Would you be facing Jerusalem from the other side?
Peter, were you wanting to say something? Peter Snow,
Yes, Peter Snow.
you're on mute.
No, I was merely agreeing with George, because when I was brought up, we were always taught that they faced towards Jerusalem.
Mm.
And then going around the world, as I have done so many times, that idea was totally destroyed. And if you go to, the business of lodge rooms facing east, where I go for my lodge meetings in Mark Mason's Hall and in Freemasons Hall in London, I would say that the majority of the lodge rooms don't face east. And even the main entrance of the building is not east. So there's a lot of mythology to it rather than real factual information.
Symbolic, yeah.
Well, first of all, Peter, bonsoir, and it's nice to see you. It's a wee while since I've seen you, so I hope you're keeping well. But I can neither confirm nor deny what you said. I, of course, am not talking about the layout of the lodge rooms. I'm talking about the Christian churches. And while I accept very much what George has said and been taught, and you as well, I have not come across, I've read quite a lot in preparing this paper, and I've not come across much argument that that's the case, but I've seen lots of stuff discussing the fact that they're oriented west and east.
The idea of poles having some kind of significance, like totem poles or whatever, is common to lots and lots of cultures. And I do remember as a very young boy still when they had maypoles in England, and it was traditional for boys and girls to dance around this obvious phallic symbol. And in fact, boys dressed as girls and girls dressed as boys, I remember. It didn't last very long. We never seem to do it anymore, but that was a clearly phallic ceremony in Easter, in spring, round about now for us. And yeah, interesting. Now, somebody else put their hand up, didn't they? Yes, Jeffrey, you wanted to.
It was the East-West business. I think when I grew up in a high church Anglican situation, I was told that the altar was in the east because it was where the sun rose. And as a Christian sort of symbolism, the sun rising at the service, and people facing the rising sun, which is S-U-N-S-O-N. That was what the symbolism was. Also, at funerals, the coffin is placed with the head in the west and the feet in the east, so that when the body rises, it faces the rising sun, and the burial's the same. But of course, in this world, there's pragmatism has to be there. Wellington Cathedral, for example, faces north-south because that's the shape of the plot of land that it was put on, but it's still called East-West. And the same with the Great Temple in London, I think. It's just a matter of how you fit it on. But there's always a sort of ceremonial East and a ceremonial West. And when I was in India once, I went to Lucknow, and I went to the place where the siege of Lucknow was, and people died there from illnesses as well as being under siege. And the burials there were east-west until they ran out of ground, and then they started to put them anywhere. That was an interesting thing. I mentioned to my guide, who was a Sikh, in fact, and he said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Well, I gave him the idea," and he said, "Well, of course, everyone's got their own little quirks and their religions."
There's a little bit more to it in terms of the rising sun. In most churches, I also had a somewhat religious upbringing, albeit Methodist, and most churches, and particularly Anglican type churches and Catholic churches, as far as I'm aware, and this is just from observation, have a very long window, a stained glass window at the wall back of the altar, and the rising sun, of course, comes in and illuminates the altar. And then there's another element to it as well, and it's not to do with Christianity, it's got to do with pre-Christian times. And it's very obvious in my home country in Ireland, when you look at some of the archaeological remains, that some of them subterranean remains, which have openings to allow the sun to come in, they will be oriented to pick up the rays of the first rise of the sun. And that will be shot, that sun will shine its ray straight down the middle of that chamber.
It's always struck me that sun worship is actually a very logical view for a religious belief in a god. Sun worship with this, you know, powerful warming, makes things grow, etc., etc., and that you would naturally come to worship it. So, yeah, and it's interesting, of course, that we've picked up on in Freemasonry, not just on your pillars, Jack, but in lots of other things, you know, going around the movement of the sun clockwise. And of course, all the Grand Masters have in the middle of their apron a sun, and they're the only ones that wear that. We did an article in the Square many years ago because one of the a new co-Masonic Grand Lodge in England, the new Grand Master, who was a woman, there is no standard for that design for the sun in the middle of the apron. And if you look at them, you see they're all different. And she wanted a more feminine sun. And there were a number of designs, and we covered this in the article of what kind of designs that, and then finally she chose one that she was happy with. Interesting, isn't it? More comments? Yes, Alan.
If I may.
Alan, I saw you put your hand up, Alan Martin. I'll come to you, John, in a moment.
Thank you, Michael. Just echoing for what Jack said, I visited New Grange in July 1997.
Yes.
There's a poem about it, about the circular symbols, and from time immemorial, Isis is New Grange. So it goes back, I think, pre-Christianity, right back. I took it right back to the reading I did, right back to Isis.
Yes.
That was when Isis was a respectable name, not now.
Yes. John Mitchell.
I was just going to ask a question, Jack. The sun doesn't rise in the east on every single day of the year.
I'm very familiar. I'm very familiar with this argument, John. And
it's not an argument; it's a fact.
I used the wrong word. I accept that fact, and I had it very well explained to me down at Carterton when I went to. When I went, yes, the guy there explained that to me very well. He also explained something else, which I didn't know, and I fully believe now because he gave me a very good reason. People who believe they're a certain star sign are often mistaken, and he has a large thing set out on the ground up there to prove to you. I'm a Virgo, for example. I'm right on the cusp of Libra. I'm the 22nd of September. My birthday's coming up soon, folks, on the 22nd of September. And I am actually Virgo, but people beside me who thought they were, I don't know, Sagittarius, were shocked to find that they weren't. So you're quite right. It doesn't come up exactly at the same point all the time.
And the second point is you're talking about the cathedrals with twin towers.
Yeah.
Now, when I did a tour of Germany and some of the cathedrals, that was explained that Catholic churches have the twin towers, not other religious orders.
Well, my answer to that is quite simple. We're talking here in most of the buildings that I've been looking at medieval times. So there was no choice. They were Catholic or not. But having said that, I was going to put, as I said, the cathedral in my home city, St. Anne's Cathedral. And it's exactly that design, and it's not medieval. So, and it's I believe, well, it is. It's Church of Ireland, which is a branch of Anglicanism. Yeah.
Now, Andy, you were waving at one stage. Where are you? There you are. You've unmuted yourself. Right.
Yeah. Good evening, all. And I'd like to say thank you very much to Jack for the presentation. I found it very, very interesting. I would like to return briefly to the point of the maypole. And growing up as a young boy in Grenada in the West Indies, remember we used to have carnivals. And those that were allowed to join the maypole were very specialized people, if you like, and had a certain dance about them. And I never at the time realized the phallic symbolism, if you like, of the maypole, because I grew up in a very Seventh-day Adventist conventional church. So now that I have heard some of the explanation, it just brings back to me the memory of some of the things that I grew up with. And now I realize the symbolism of the maple. And you're quite right, we don't see it anymore. And it's really a shame because it used to be a brilliant display.
Well done. 2 days ago, Andy, I did a presentation myself, a Zoom presentation to the Grand Lodge of Trinidad, Tobago and Grenada.
Awesome. Thank
Good
you very
bunch
much.
of guys. Now, we did have a question came through. Someone saying, what's this website where there's all of these 200 presentations that we can listen to? David Chichinadze, you're there somewhere, aren't you? Has he disappeared? Is he still here? Dave, there you are, David.
I'm here.
If you were to jump in now and make a comment or a little question, that gives you an opportunity to do a quick plug for superiority.
Well,
Go
definitely, I'm enjoying so much all the lectures, and this one was particularly interesting. From my side, I would say I'm part of the Orthodox, you would call it Greek Orthodox Church, but we don't have one pope in Orthodoxy. We have every national churches. So I'm part of the Georgian Orthodox Church. It is like 99% similar to Greek Orthodox or Ukrainian or Russian or Romanian one. So I rechecked again now while you were speaking, and I would agree. I guess it was Brother John who said that no other, it was quite particularly common to Catholic architecture of Catholic Church architecture to have the two columns in it. We don't really have those so much emphasized in our architecture in Orthodox ones. So the main point is that from above, if you look from above, it's always the cross, like every single church. That was the main idea.
I do need to make a slight correction to something I said earlier. Of course, I said in medieval times there was just the Catholic Church or nothing. That, of course, is not the fact. When the Eastern Church split from the Western Church, of course, other versions of Christianity developed and developed their own particular formats.
Jack, in your plan of the temple, is there anywhere for people to sit? With David talking about Greek Orthodox, if you go to Russia and you go to their churches, there's nowhere to sit. You've got, I think they make you stand all the time. So I'm just wondering, was that the case in any of these temples? Were you supposed to stand?
I think no, it wasn't. And the idea wasn't necessarily that it was a place where you all piled in to worship. The worship was the priest worshiping the deity. Now, people, of course, would have come in, but I don't think they came in en masse to have a sort of a great sort of equivalent of a Catholic mass, for example. I don't think that happened. Yeah. So the answer is no.
Right. You know why we have seats in cathedrals and big churches in the Christian church? It was to stop people dancing. I'm serious. They used to go in and there was great celebrations and dancing, which used to get a little out of hand with some of your fertility things that were going on.
Well, I do recall I do recall church pews because I sat on many of them. Yes. And they were actually very hard. I think they were there as a sort of religious punishment to people who suffered with hemorrhoids.
When Christopher Wren designed St. Paul's Cathedral, some of his early designs were rejected. And one was rejected because it had too many dark corners in which it was said nuns would probably be raped. So they rejected the design. Anyway, any more questions, comments?
Yes, if I might.
Right, Ian. You're on.
Yes, thanks, Jack. First of all, congratulations. It's most entertaining evening. Just an observation with regard to the orientation of bodies and whether it's how old it is. So about 2 decades ago, I was involved in surveying for the gas pipeline through Tasmania. And when we were And some of the routes that were proposed for the pipeline, we actually had to have a First Nation person with us, looking to see if there are artifacts of importance to them as to whether or not the pipeline had to be moved. At the end of it, and for this reason I won't say where it is in Tasmania, he took me to a burial place, a very ancient burial place, and he said their people always buried the body preferably on the western side of a stream, and always with their feet towards the sun, so that when the sun rose, they saw it. And I thought, and that's their history. It is handed down by word of mouth from generations, and we now know that our First Nation people in Australia go back over 40,000 years, and I found that to be a great privilege to have actually been taken and shown this area, which is dreadfully important. It's on private property, and they live in fear of the farmer ploughing that area. He never has.
That's very interesting, Ian. Of course, it's very well known that the Christian faith, when Constantine, for example, converted from paganism as a Roman emperor in Constantinople, I suppose, that they would adopt pagan practices to fit in with the Christian message, because that made it easier for them to sell the Christian message to the pagans. So, for example, everybody knows that's Easter. The name of Easter is a pagan name, and lots of other strange little things were used, taken from the pagan faith and incorporated into the Christian story. And so the fact that we have discussed the orientation of the church being east to west, and we mentioned the bodies of the deceased being buried in such a way that they're facing the rising sun, etc. That has its roots, in my opinion, right back in the religions which came before the Christian faith. I think we've adopted it. Yeah.
Can I hop in there?
Yes,
Because
I was just going to say, Richard, I've seen you with your hand up.
Thank you. Jack, you've basically introduced the comment I was going to make perfectly. I'm going to make a comment on that, and then I'm going to go back to what you said previously a few minutes ago and correct you, because you're actually the wrong way round.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Happy to be told.
Thank you. Not a problem. Constantine was a Roman emperor, yes, but he was actually Greek. And he realized that establishing Christianity and accepting it was a good way of controlling the people. And what happened in 300 AD was the establishment of the Orthodox Church, which consisted of 5 archdioceses, one in Constantinople, one in Antioch, one in Jerusalem, one in Alexandria, and one in Rome. Now, those 5 archdioceses were 100% equal with each other and all agreed on the same things. Now, the Great Schism occurred in about 1030 AD, where the Roman archdiocese broke away from the other 4. So it was the Roman Church, the Western Church as it's known now, that left the Eastern Church, because the other 4 archdioceses are still in existence today. And I can see David is nodding his head because he is Russian Orthodox. I'm actually Greek Orthodox.
Georgian one. No, please, Georgian one, not Russian.
Georgian, okay, thank you, Georgian. But the thing is, what happened? Why is Orthodox religion up in the north there, in Georgia and other places, is because Saint Cyrilius and Saint Methodius went up there. At the time, they did not have a written language, and Cyrilius used the Greek alphabet, modified it a little bit to produce the Russian alphabet, and that's why it's called Cyrillic script. And of course, Saint Methodius was someone who was into methodology. So I'll leave it at that.
Well done, Richard.
I'd like a chance to respond to that. I accept everything you're saying, Richard. And I do understand, I don't have the same degree of knowledge, but I'm aware of the Great Schism. It doesn't negate the main thrust of my argument, though. And the main thrust of my argument wasn't really to do with Constantine as such. It was to do with the fact that when they were promoting the Christian message in the early stages, and this goes back way beyond 1000 AD or whatever it was you said, that roughly that period, because St. Patrick did the same thing in Ireland. They would incorporate, and St. Patrick was, I think, I haven't got my dates right, I think he was about 400 or 500 AD. I'm not quite sure about that, but he was certainly around about then. And they would incorporate some of the pagan practices in order to make it more palatable to the population to accept the Christian teaching.
Of course.
Indeed.
David, you were just going to respond quickly, weren't you? David, you wanted to say something quickly. And then Lewis, I know you've had your hand up. Give you 2 minutes.
Just whatever Richard just described is correct, totally. But you are reading from the Christianization of, I guess, Russian territory or Russian part, which happened in 8th or 9th century, the earliest. And it happened in Ukraine, actually, which was called Rus. The Christianity, right after the Constantine kind of made it official state religion, it went to surrounding countries, including Georgia, which counts its official Christianity from 340 something 30s. But Christianity also was spread right after the Christ, and at least 2 apostles or disciples, you would say, preached to the countries. And that is one of the preconditions to have your own autocephaly, which is independence.
Yeah.
It is that disciples should have preached on that territory. So that's why Georgia has this privilege. Russia is just to have a good idea. The discipled, equal to disciples lady, Sophia, I suppose, preached in Ukraine, Kiev, which was the real Rus back then. And now Russian Orthodox Church takes that legacy as for his own kind of autocephaly to be present. Thank you.
You can see, Richard, that accusing the Greek Orthodox of being Russian Orthodox is like accusing a New Zealander of being an Australian. You know, it's the same sort of.
That's why I'm confused, because I'm both. I have 2 birth certificates.
Yeah,
I have
right.
a New Zealand birth certificate and an Australian birth certificate.
We've
Figure that
forgiven you
one out.
already. Lewis, you wanted to say something. I know you've been waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And thank you, Jack, for that really fascinating talk. I have to say I'm in vigorous agreement with you on the fertility symbolism of Solomon's temple. And in fact, if we're thinking about Solomon's temple, one of the things that naturally comes to mind is the Sanctum Sanctorum, and what was contained within that being the Ark of the Covenant. You may well already be aware of this from your studies, but a meaning of the word ark is actually womb. When you go back to the ancient languages, Hebrew and such, and that's got a lot of implications as well. This maybe adds a bit more to the fertility symbolism. And if you're interested in hearing about my perspectives on it, Victorian Lodge of Research next month, I'll be talking about the Ark of the Covenant, and we'll be addressing some of those ideas.
Send me a link.
Great plug.
So
Brendan.
Freud was right. It is all about sex. It's all about sex. Now, I noticed that we have here the Master of United Masters. There he is, Russell Ward. And I've been hoping that at some point, Russell, you might invite Jack to come to Auckland and perhaps do one of his presentations up there. Does that appeal to you? Do you have any points or questions for him?
Yep, very much. Very much. He'll keep them awake with the sexuality of it.
I thought you'd choose the mucky one, yes. Okay, now I'm looking, because I'm trying to jump from screen to screen, as you can imagine. I've only got certain, so unless people have put their hand up, and I can't see if anybody else, any more comments or questions?
Just on that point you made, Mike, about who would have gone in the temple. lots of tracing boards, second degree ones, say the pillars were placed there to remind the Israelites, I forget the exact wording, in going to and returning from divine worship, which is really the people writing it having a church view of the world and assuming the same took place there. But I tend to agree with Jack. Yeah. The common person would not have got anywhere near the place. There have probably been several walls to keep the commoner away, and it would have been a select few allowed actually between those two pillars would be my guess.
You're absolutely right, because you know in Christian churches, Catholic churches, there was a screen, a rood screen, R-O-O-D, which was between the nave where the common people were and the whole altar area where the choir and those various things were. And the common people did not go through that. It was actually gated. And all of those were taken away, of course, in the Reformation and various things. But if you go in a lot of the old churches, you can still see the marks of where those screens were. And of course, some churches still have them. You're absolutely right. The common masses got nowhere near, and they certainly don't go into the middle chamber to get their wages.
No, yeah. No, I have
not a chance.
Mike, I'm looking at I've got a copy of the floor plan in my hand as I'm speaking, and of course it's someone's imagination using as their source the biblical description. But the way I look at it is, once you go in from the courtyard and you go past the pillars of Boaz and Jachin, you're right into the holy place, heading towards the altar, and they have the 10 tables sitting around for the shewbread, and the priests would be going around lifting the shewbread at the right time, once every 7 days, and the priest would be looking after it and making sure that the bread was there suitable for the deity. There's absolutely no evidence in the drawing of any imagination that the hoi polloi might be allowed in. So that's the answer to your question.
Of course, right. Sorry, Brendan, we cut you off then. You were just going to say something more, weren't you?
Well, I was just wondering, because really there's only ever been one civilization that had arcs as part of their ceremony, and that was the Egyptians. And I'm just wondering, I'll probably get shot for this comment, but only one high priest was ever able to go into the actual room where the ark was, and that was because each time when the brand new one went in, you'd go in and go, it's Egyptian. Close the curtain
again. Absolutely right. Okay, well, look, now we're getting to our time to wind up, but if there's one more point or question, we could take it. Andy, you're waving. I can see you waving.
Yes, just going back to what Brendan has said about the Catholic Church and the screens and everything. I remember I belonged to the Catholic Church as a kid. I was one of the very few in my family that was christened Catholic because there wasn't an Anglican priest in the village at the time. But I remember the priest actually giving, when you went to for communion, he gave you the bread, but he was the only brother that drank the wine.
Oh,
and
yes.
the ordinary people never actually got to drink the wine. I don't know if anybody had any comment on that, yes?
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
I want to tell you, actually, Andy, that's not quite true. I was the head altar boy, and I'm telling you that altar boys had a bit of it as well.
I'm sure they would have done.
Was that with the Mars bar as well?
Well, no, what I need to do now...
Make one comment?
George, quick,
Well,
yes.
very briefly, Brendan actually introduced a little bit of humour there, saying that the ark was Egyptian. Well, actually, it was probably made in Egypt, because that's where the Israelites had been for centuries and centuries. Yeah. And they were led out by Moses, who carried the ark out. So it did actually come from Egypt.
All right.
If we had Egyptian hieroglyphics.
If we were writing the ritual today, George, it would probably be made in China, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, but we wouldn't tell people that.
What I want to tell you about, of course, is Jack's book, The Ramble Around the Pillars, and people will say, how can I get a copy? Jack's given now 4 of his talks from the 8 that are available He will only be giving 6 of the 8. If you've enjoyed it, there's 7 more good talks. It's a beautifully produced book. It's very easy to read, nice large type for old eyes, and each story is very, very good. What we've arranged, because of course what would have happened is that Jack would have had these in the Wellesley hotel, and now you'd be buying them, is we've arranged for stocks of them to be sent to every one of the main hosts, and you can get one from your local main host, your local research lodge, and that we're not charging them postage. But if you can't do that and you come through to myself or to Jack, we will be very happy to send you a copy. Jack will sign it for you and dedicate it whichever way you want, but we will ask you to cover the postage on that. We are selling them at $30, and this is the way that we obviously ensure that these tours happen, because this is the only income that we have. With cancelling all of the tour and the traveling around, of course, the various centres, it's cost them nothing. So we have to pay money back to some of them because, of course, there's been no travel, no accommodation, and all of that kind of thing. So this is the only way that we're going to get some income from Jack's tour, which is going very, very well. He is, of course, giving 2 more talks. Next week, he will be on Tuesday and Thursday at the same times. And the Tuesday one will be his chapter 7, which is 2 wild Irishmen, that's wild with an E on the end, William and Oscar, telling the story of the Oscar and William Wilde. And then on Thursday, he will give chapter 8 of his book, which is William Butler Yeats, The Mystic and the Influence of Freemasonry. 2 very good stories that we're looking forward to. So if there's nothing else, Jack, do you have a final word, or are you happy for us to call it a day?
I'm very happy. I've enjoyed the questions and such like, and I just wanted to make the point that, as is usual in an Irishman's experience, I make no money whatsoever from this.
Mike,
Mike, regarding the book, I don't know if you've had any requests from Australia, but did you want to send 10 over or something? Because I figure it'll probably work out cheaper postage to send a bulk lot and then send
Would you
them
like
out
me
here.
to send to you personally and to your personal address?
Yeah, I reckon I could flog 10.
Right, we'll do that for you. We'll send 10.
Mike,
Brendan,
one last
Brendan,
point.
you might want to check with
Remember-
David later. I believe David has ordered and actually received some books.
Okay.
Okay, you check. I'll talk to you in the
check.
next couple of days, Brendan, and we can sort it out. George,
Mike,
final word?
just remind everybody that we are going to put all these Zoom presentations up on the web.
Ah, yes. David Chichinadze is helping us with this so that they will all be available on YouTube, that Facebook,
YouTube.
so that you'll be able to see YouTube, you'll be able to see them. And what we're going to ask Jack to do is to actually do the two presentations that he's not doing. So you'll have all 8 that you'll be able to have a look. You get the idea, yes.
That's
so
racist, George.
that's really it. Jack, thank you again for a most interesting talk. I'm really looking forward to the next 2 next week. Thank you all for coming. Same time, Tuesday, Thursday, same connect. The link that you've used is the same on both occasions next week. George, thank you for organizing this and being the technical guru to make sure that everything works.
It's a pleasure.
Right.
I shall stop the recording.